I want to say that for those who didn't hear, we are beginning a Celebrate Recovery. We're getting together every Tuesday to look at the Beatitudes, to look at how we can grow closer to God, and taking kind of an honest look at the obstacles we have in our life that are keeping us from growing closer to God, where we get together as a group that supports one another and try to look at how we can apply those principles, like being poor in spirit, like hungering and thirsting for righteousness, how we can apply those to our life. Last week we got together. We were a little bit hindered because we had a tornado warning right before. That's okay. And it was a little bit of an introduction, and so we're going to have a couple of weeks of introduction. So you didn't miss anything, and feel free to come if you're curious, if you're interested. And if you come and decide, well, we're not really that interested, that's fine. Just come and see what it's about and see if this is something you'd be interested in. There's no commitment for you to come. We're getting together again Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Today is Mother's Day, right? I need to call my mother later today. I've got to write that down. My sisters and I were talking about what are we doing for Mom this Mother's Day, and I said, she's been getting a lot of attention lately. I don't want her to start to expect it and get spoiled. Maybe we ignore this one? We're not going to, of course. I sent her a candle that said, "This is a gift from your favorite child." And I made sure the package didn't have my name on it. So today, in honor of Mother's Day, I put together a bunch of succulents out in the front. If you are a mother, grab one. If you're going to see your mother today or tomorrow, grab one. We have plenty. Don't be afraid to take them all. And I guess one more thing is make sure to give some extra love to the four hands. Are the four hands here? Where are they? There they are. This is your last Sunday, right? Yeah. Show some extra love to the four hands this morning. So this morning, as we're talking about Mother's Day, first I want to talk a little bit about suffering, right? Trials, difficulties in life. When we're talking about suffering in a biblical context, there's one question that just comes up constantly. Atheists are always using this question to challenge the gospel. This is a question that people ask when they're trying to understand God's gospel. This is a question Christians ask when they're going through suffering themselves. And the classic question really is, why does God allow suffering? And volumes of books have been written, enough to fill probably multiple libraries to try to answer this question. This question's been around since the beginning, and it's going to be around until the end. And when you come to the Bible trying to look for an answer on why does God allow suffering, you really don't find one single answer. You find multiple answers, that there is no single answer that answers all circumstances, all difficulties, all moments of suffering. So you can go through the Bible and you can see a handful of different reasons why God allows suffering. One of them is the consequences of your own actions. That kind of makes sense, right? Proverbs 13 says, the way of the treacherous is their ruin. When you make bad decisions, it's going to harm you. Another reason is punishment, discipline. We don't like that idea, but there are many times whenever God will discipline people for things that they have done wrong, but a lot of the times, and most of the times, it's to discipline, not to just condemn, but He's trying to get you to learn a lesson. One thing I want to note is just because you're suffering, just because something bad happens, doesn't necessarily mean you were punished. At one point, Jesus said, what about the 18 people who died when the Tower of Siloam fell and it killed 18 people? Were they the worst sinners out of all Jerusalem? No. Right? He's saying just because some people died doesn't mean that they were evil and God was punishing them. Sometimes when we're suffering, it's Satan behind it. Paul talks about, I have a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan. Sometimes Satan causes our sufferings. And when you're looking at suffering, sometimes it's multiple answers of these. Sometimes it's the consequences of other people's actions. Like when other people do wrong, and then there are bad consequences. Sometimes that happens to you, whether it's your parents, whether it's your coworkers, whether it's your friends, whether it's your government, whatever it is, we suffer because of other people. Probably one of the biggest ones, all suffering is a consequence of Adam and Eve's decision. I mean, we'd be in the Garden of Eden if it wasn't for that. And so all suffering, all difficulty is because that one choice that Adam and Eve made. And there are some good benefits to suffering. I know that sometimes that sounds paradoxical, but God does have purpose in allowing us to suffer or even causing suffering. One of the purposes, just like how suffering is a consequence of Adam's sin, suffering reminds us how terrible sin is and how amazing grace is. Because all the corruption in this world is a consequence of sin, and it reminds us how terrible sin is. And then it helps us to know how amazing God's grace is when He forgives us of our sin. God has other purposes, like He wants us to grow. James says, well, when you're being tested, count it joy, because you're going to grow. Or in 2 Corinthians, Paul said, there were plenty of times where we thought we were about to die. And he says, but these happened so that we would depend on God and not on ourselves. Suffering made him depend on God more. So there are good benefits. And one of the best benefits is it makes us want to get to heaven. We look at this world and say, this world comes with a lot of difficulties. I don't want it to just be here. Well, good news, it's not just here. But you serve the Lord here, you have faith in the gospel, and you will have that paradise that I think every person longs for. But there's something really important that I really want to say. Like, we could go through all the reasons of suffering, why we're suffering, God's purpose, Satan's design, the consequences. But a lot of the times, there are some times when all these reasons don't make a single difference. If you get a flat tire, if you have a cold, if you have a bad day, well, these reasons might be helpful to know. Because if you're on the side of the road trying to fix a flat tire and it's raining, you might think to yourself, Satan is trying to get me angry. Or you might think to yourself, hey, this is a chance to work on my patience as a Christian. But when someone is suffering, and I mean truly suffering, these reasons aren't enough. When someone is in the gutter of life and their life is really just falling apart, telling them, oh, this will make you grow. They don't care. It's not worth it. I mean, these facts of God's purpose behind suffering, when you are really in the depths of it, when you are going through the worst moments of your life, these facts actually become offensive. Do you mean God allowed my child to have cancer so I could grow? Wait, are you saying if Satan is the one who made me lose my job, then why didn't God do anything? Wait, I'm in the hospital because a drunk driver hit my car and God was too busy to make him look the other direction? In those heated moments that we've probably all been in before, when you're not thinking rationally, the rational answer doesn't do anything for you. When someone is in one of those moments, you know what? They don't want an essay. They don't want academic reasons. They don't really want a book, chapter, verse on the exact reason why they're suffering. They don't want to know that they're growing. They would rather not grow. At that moment, they don't need the rational answer. What do they need? Well, they don't need for you to sit back and try to explain all the reasons behind their suffering. Or when someone says, why doesn't God care? They don't need you to sit back and say, you shouldn't say that. Let me tell you, God does care. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. And that's really when you look at the book of Job. Job lost everything. All of his business, all of his possessions, all of his wealth, on top of it all, his kids, his health, his relationship with his wife. Job's friends sat there. And the whole book of Job is Job's friends saying, listen, here's why you're suffering. And the only comfort Job ever got was through God's power and goodness, not the reasons why we suffer. If they're going to listen to anything, and there's really not a guarantee that they're going to in those moments, the one thing they really need to hear, God loves you. In that moment, they need to hear that God is still there with them, seeing their pain, hearing their cries, and working to give them comfort. When you're in one of those moments, when you're with someone who is suffering, that's what you need to tell them. When you're in one of those moments, when you're the person suffering and you can't think rationally, that's what you need to think of. That's what you need to hear. Just remember that no matter how it feels, God loves you and He is still right there with you. And the passages I want to look at today are going to show that. We're going to look at the story of Hagar. And there are two instances of Hagar that are extremely parallel, and I think it's by design. Hagar was punished for doing nothing wrong. Twice in the book of Genesis, Hagar is at the end of her rope. She is hurting. And these two instances, again, they're almost exactly identical. But this is moments where she thinks herself and her son are going to die. Both times, God comes to her and comforts her. So, in Genesis 16, the story really revolves around Abraham and Sarah. Right? Abraham didn't have any kids, but they were in their old age. God comes to him and says, Abraham, I'm going to get you a kid. Even though you may be old, we're going to get you a kid. And Abraham and Sarah are on this journey as they're looking for a new land that God sent them to get. And it's been several years, and now Abraham and Sarah are getting impatient. They want that child. They want that child. God promised that through that child they would have so many descendants that that child would become a great nation. And Abraham and Sarah, they're a little impatient. Sarah says, you know what? What if we have a child, just not through me? And it's like, well, how can that go wrong? It does, yeah. And what you have is this really sad byproduct. Hagar, the reason she suffered is the consequences of other people's actions, because Sarah's lack of faith for God to keep the promise. And really in the story, what we see is Abraham being neutral and not defending Hagar or not telling Sarah, hey, this is a bad idea. But Hagar, she had no choice. She is a slave. Abraham and Sarah hold all the power here. So I want to read these stories. One note, Abraham and Sarah, they have their names changed. Right now, they're Abram and Sarai. In Genesis 16. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. How could this go wrong? He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So here, Hagar, maybe she did do one thing wrong. She started to despise Sarah. Because Hagar, she's a slave in this situation. Abraham's going to say, you know what, we're going to try and have a child through you. Abraham's going to lay with Hagar. Hagar being a slave, does she get a choice in the matter? No. And this very possibly could have been rape. Probably, right? And so Hagar, having no choice, she just conceives, right? And now she begins to despise Sarah. Why is she despising Sarah? Well, the text doesn't say, but I think it's pretty simple to realize why. Because Sarah says, that's my kid, and Hagar's over here like, I'm the one over here having to deal with the pregnancy symptoms, the difficulty of pregnancy, and this is your kid, right? I mean, the second this kid comes out, Sarah's going to be like, look at my child, and Hagar's thinking, I don't like that, who would? And so Hagar is now having a child she probably didn't want, and that child's just going to be ripped away from her, and so Hagar probably doesn't like Sarah that much. I can't exactly think that she was thrilled for this whole situation, but what you see is Abraham, really what he should have said, he said, Sarah, this is a bad idea. Let's not do that. He didn't do that. Well, I think it's kind of funny because it was Sarah's idea, Abraham does it, and then Sarah then blames him for what she wanted him to do. And I think all the husbands in here are like, I know how that feels. Not really. Well, maybe, hopefully not really, right? But Sarah's just genuinely being very unreasonable here. Abraham's really not putting his foot down saying, no. So, read this. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. And I find that hilarious. He's like, okay, let's let the Lord judge between me and you. Yeah. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do it to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And so Sarah here blames Abraham. Abraham, again, he's just like, fine, you treat her however you want. Again, that's not a really good thing for him to do. Neither of them are really doing what's right. Hagar being mistreated, it must have been really bad because she runs away. So now Hagar has run away. She's been mistreated. She's pregnant by the husband of her abuser. She has nowhere to go. Maybe you can relate to this when you're in that hopeless situation. When you are the victim of abuse, whenever someone's treating you wrong, there's nothing you could do, and you feel like, man, I should just run away. If a pregnant woman runs away, these ancient days, they didn't have the police out there. What are the odds that something good is going to happen to her? She's going to have to walk for a long time to find people, and who knows whether those people are going to be friendly. You think a tribe is going to come across and say, hey, here's this pregnant woman. We don't mind an extra 2 mouths to feed. You think a tribe might find her and abuse her even worse? You think she's an expert in survival? You think she's going to be able to hunt food, find water while she's pregnant? She's just not in a good place. Her odds are very low. And this is what happens. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. And it was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beher Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. But Beher Lahai Roi means the well of the living one who sees me. And this is an amazing story. She was in this miserable state. The angel of the Lord found her. The angel of the Lord is just the Lord, right? This is God, the angel acting in the place of God, if not being God himself. And so the angel said, go back to Sarah. Go back to that situation. Name your child Ishmael. And he's like, Ishmael, you're going to have your son, and he's going to live a great life where he's going to have so many kids. And in Hagar's desperate place, God saw her. God found her. He listened to her affliction. He's a God who sees. He looks after her. God saw her pain and he comforted her. He took care of her. He let her know, you're not going to die. He let her know, your son's not going to die. In fact, her son becomes a very significant person in all the place of history, for better or for worse. But God gave her hope, saying, go back to Sarah. I'm going to be with you. See, she didn't need an essay on suffering. She needed someone to be there, to acknowledge her pain and to comfort her, and that's what God did. Fast forward 14 years later, Genesis 21. Hagar returns. She has her child. Ishmael is probably now around 13 years old. And Sarah finally becomes pregnant with the child that she had always wanted, right? And so when there's that tension between Hagar and Sarah. You think that went away? It definitely did not go away. And so Sarah, right now she has to settle for the surrogate son who's really not even related to her, but at least she has some sort of son in Ishmael. But then she gets pregnant. Why does she need Ishmael? Why does she need Hagar, right? And so what's Sarah going to think about Hagar and Ishmael whenever she has what she needs? Right? And maybe she's looking for the first opportunity to kick them to the curb, or maybe that's just whenever she finds the first chance, that's what she's going to do. And that's really what you see. You see Genesis 21. Sarah's child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." So Ishmael right now, not much older than 13. It's not really that surprising when you have a teenager who grows up in a divided household and he makes a small joke about his half-sibling. Not that surprising, but that's really all it took for Sarah. And so she tells Abraham, "Hey, you get him out. He's not getting half of the inheritance." And Abraham, Sarah may not be related to Ishmael, but Abraham is. Abraham's his father. And Abraham seems to have bonded so much with Ishmael. Sarah's thinking, oh, we can just get rid of him. And Abraham's certainly happy to have this son, Isaac, but that doesn't mean he hasn't grown fond towards Ishmael. And so this hurts him. But in this moment, Abraham, having his wife told him to get them out, he really doesn't want to, but God says he will look after her. So the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered into the desert of Beersheba. Abraham really probably felt a little bit better knowing that God was going to take care of her, but still he was hurting. And in this moment, actually, God saw his pain, and God gave him some comfort to watch over Hagar. Abraham knows this, but I don't know if Hagar does. So Hagar is kind of in the same exact situation she was 14 years ago. This time she's not pregnant, but this time she has her son, who's somewhere around the age of 13. She's out in the wilderness having to fend for herself. This time she has her son, some bread, some water, but still surviving out in the wilderness with just yourself or just a child, that's an almost impossible situation unless you're an expert. And I mean a really good expert, which Hagar, the slave, probably is not. And so we find her in a situation where she thinks her and her son is about to die. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went out and sat opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite to him, she lifted up her voice and wept. This, if you're just imagining it in your head, is heartbreaking. Hagar left her son in the shade of a bush. She walked away. And you could ask, why is she walking away? Why is it the distance of a bow shot? I don't think she actually have a bow and arrow. She's about to shoot him. I know some people who might think that. Bow shot is, far enough to where you can see each other, but you really can't, but it's still pretty far. Is she about to abandon her child? That's kind of what it sounds like me, where she leaves him off, and she doesn't want to see her child die, but she might think her child is about to die. Did she put her child there so she can look for water? Is she accepting that they're about to die? Did she walk away so her son doesn't hear her crying? To me, it sounds like she's abandoning her child because she knows he's going to die anyway. But just like last time, God comes to the rescue. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God came to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. So last time, Genesis 16, there was this emphasis on God seeing. Here, the emphasis is on God hearing. Twice, it says, God heard the boy crying. Twice. God kept Hagar from dying twice. God saved the life of Ishmael twice. Once in the womb and once when he was 13. See, we read the story of Abraham. And Abraham was just given this huge promise that his son would be this great nation. Abraham is chosen by God. Abraham really is such a huge pillar in all of God's plan. If it wasn't for, Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. And so Abraham's this pillar in God's scheme of redemption throughout history for mankind. And it might be easy to start thinking, well, he's one of the important ones. God has to spend all of his time with Abraham. He's the main character here. I don't know, maybe we think that today. God's focused on all the people who are doing the big stuff, the people who are really important in God's plan, the people doing all the baptizing, the people who are out, a missionary in France, the minister being persecuted in Africa, the big name preacher somewhere in a town in Kokomo or in Indiana. I'm not talking about myself. That was a joke. God is focused on the important things, no doubt. But that doesn't mean he overlooks other things. And sometimes what we think is important is not always what God thinks is important. Thinking in a human way, Hagar isn't anyone important. Is she worth God's time? Hagar was a slave, a lowly servant girl. She didn't even have the power to say no. She was a castaway. She was barely part of the family, and the second she got replaced, she was thrown out. She is this pregnant mother who didn't belong anywhere. She was a mother with an illegitimate son who everyone thought wouldn't amount to anything. God has more important things to do, you might think. You see, the God we serve does it all. The creator of the universe is not limited to the most important things, the most important people. A pregnant slave on her own, God saw it. A little boy, the boy of a struggling mother, God heard his cry. See, God cares about pregnant women. God cares for the women who aren't sure how they're going to provide for their children. Maybe the children may be overlooked by society and looked as legitimate. This woman who has been abused, the children who are labeled as inconvenient and seen as replaceable. No woman can cry without God seeing. No child can cry without God hearing. We serve a God who cares about the people who have been thrown away. We serve a God who cares about people who no one else cares about. We serve a God who sees your pain and hears your cry. That makes me want to serve Him even more. These two stories that are just so parallel, I think there's a reason that they're written like this, where you see two instances. This is really all you see of Hagar at all. And the two instances you see is how Hagar is being abused and mistreated, and yet God is caring for her. Our God is a God of comfort. 2 Corinthians 1. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which ourselves are comforted by God. God gives us comfort, and we are able to comfort others. See, whatever our struggle may be, God helps. Hagar was in this desperate need of help, used, abused, not knowing how to care for herself or her child. God heard her cry. God came to her rescue. And so when we see people in this position, in a place like Hagar, they don't need an essay on suffering. They need to know God sees it, God hears it, He's there. When you see someone in that position, your role isn't necessarily to explain everything. Your role needs to be what God's role is here, to simply be there, to acknowledge their pain and comfort them, just like God did to Hagar, just like God does to us. And I'm not saying there isn't maybe some times to start explaining suffering. I'm not saying there isn't some time to have that discussion. I'm saying try to realize that there are times when the wound is too fresh to start having that discussion. And I just have one more verse I want to look at. I was reading through Isaiah one time, and I kind of stumbled on this verse, and it stuck with me for a while. You know, there are few things stronger in life than a mother's love for their child, right? I mean, a good mother loves their child so much. But this is what God says. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. God's love is even stronger than the love a mother has for her child. You know, all of this really reminds me of, how a mother reacts to their child's pain. You know, when a child's in trouble, mothers turn into superheroes. They turn into Usain Bolt, bolting down. They will lift the car off their child. It's incredible. But if God has so much more power and so much more love, isn't that so much more incredible for how He treats us when we're in trouble? You see, if you are hurting and no one knows, God knows. God sees it and God hears it. And I think my request is, if you're hurting, let us see and hear it too. Let us join God by your bedside to show you some comfort and to let you know you're not alone. To just be there to acknowledge your pain and to comfort you in whatever way we can. So the invitation this morning is for those who feel like Hagar, who are hurting, who feel like they're at their rope's end, and they just need to hear that someone's there for them. If that's you this morning, then answer the invitation. The elders are going to be in the back, and I'm going to be right here. Come forward as we stand and as we sing.